Eli Hirtle and Arielle Twist, and then Jordan will join us towards the end of the panel discussion to participate more in the conversational component as well as questions from the audience. So what I'll do is I'll read each artist's biography, let them talk about their work for about 10 minutes or so, and then we'll work through some more discussion. So today's panel is loosely organized around the idea of experimental text and language. These artists will speak maybe directly and indirectly to these ideas, but we'll also give them the room to talk about their work as they feel fit. So I'll start with Siku. So Siku Allooloo is an Inuk Haitian Taino writer, artist, and land-based educator from Denman Bay, Northwest Territories, Pond Inlet, and Pond Inlet. She also belongs to a Dene Suline family, a strong lineage of storytellers, leaders on all three sides who have raised her to be close to the land. Siku has been leading resurgence-based work since 2012 through both community building and the arts, alongside other Indigenous artists across the country. Much of Siku's work centers on decolonial ethics, resurgence, and transformation. Her writing and artistic work have been featured in Canadian Art Magazine, Briar Patch Magazine, the Malahat Review, The Guardian, the New Quarterly, Nuit Blanche Toronto, and Hexam, To Be Here Always. So, here it is.
Hello, and thank you for having me. My name is Siku Allooloo. I am very grateful to be here on Seal territory and to have been invited by Tanya and to be sharing the stage with an older friend and some new friends. I asked Toby to pull up a map so I can give you a visual explanation of where I'm from, who I'm from, and where I'm rooted. My mother was Taino and Haitian from Haiti, so in the Caribbean, that little tiny point, which is where Columbus and the first conquistadors landed. They met my Taino ancestors, and they declared us extinct a few generations later. My mom always said, don't believe them, and we are very much still Taino, and she spent a lot of her life's work amassing resources and information and reclaiming our identity and maintaining our culture, our heritage. My father is from Mitamatalik, from Pond Inlet, which is the northernmost star on this map. We're the other end of the extreme, so we were among the very last to encounter newcomers. My father is a residential school survivor, and he factors a lot in my writing. Actually, both my sides do, my mother and my father. I'm often writing about different contrasts as a very mixed, contrasty person myself. I'm always trying to understand the impacts of colonialism through these two lenses. What does it mean to be the very first, to be colonized, to be so fragmented, to be, as Jordan was talking about, so disenfranchised, and to not have a clear pathway back to something that is intact, that in fact has become very Creole. We're mixed, and it's a brand new thing that has taken place there, that continually takes place there. Where I actually was born and mostly raised is in Denende, in Dene territory, and I'm part of a Dene family through my older brother and sister's dad, who he and his family took me and my little brother and made us part of their family after we lost our mom. And so my my grounding and my land connection is through my Dene family and in that Dene territory. I wanted to share a bit about my work in a different light. I haven't really talked about before, but thinking about how my mom's homeland of Haiti, I've always thought of it as this epicenter of these crazy forces, like Columbus landing, and like that's where the first collision happened. And it's also where the very first slave revolt took place that overthrew colonial power. And Haiti now, it's one of the very most impoverished communities, countries in the world, and it's perpetually plagued by atrocity and tragedy. And yet that's not the full story. There's such incredible resilience, and there's a whole movement of people that are reclaiming Taino culture, language, dances, ceremonies, that is still happening even after we were declared extinct, and it's happening in the diaspora, all through the States, it's happening all through the Caribbean. And that's something I only learned about 5 years ago, that's taking place, because I'm based way far in the north, and so the other extreme, actually the first short story I wrote about is about what it means to be descended from these Taino people and to come back from the dead. The next short story I wrote about is called Caribou People, and it's about what does it mean to trace colonialism through two lines, two generations in my family, and through the impact of extractivism through our relationship with the caribou and the destruction of the land. And then my poetry kind of I try to give access points through an inside-out understanding of what those things are. And my whole project is always trying to hold these extremes, these complexities together, where I'm not formally trained as a writer. Writing is just something I've always done, and the things I've been told by people that teach writing or are involved in the art world, the writing world, except for like the native writers that I talk to, but the other pros say it needs to be distinct, like how they always try and keep us in distinct categories, like are you Inuk or are you like not, or are you like they want to clearly delineate things, and I'm one example of like something you cannot actually just fit in one box. They fit in multiple boxes, and I'm trying to hold those together and not alienate these fragments that make up who I am. I wanted to share a couple of the poems with you that it's me trying to hold things that collide together. One of the things that I've noticed through trying to work through both these lines in my own history is that I end up in the same place, whether it's coming from like the starting point or coming from the last point of contact. We end up in a very similar place where it's just, the truth is you can't destroy us as Indigenous people. We're always going to find our way, like through Jordan's work. I mean, he's doing the same thing through your writing and your artwork. So this poem is called Survivor's Guilt. I'm a woman, and I also am trying to navigate all these internal cultural revitalization things within myself, within my family, and these different communities I belong to, amidst a context of settler colonialism and just living as a living, breathing, moving target in colonial society. So there's, it's another big contrast I find with my idea of cultural revitalization is, it's also a contrast of these extremes where the world is constantly trying to destroy, and we are constantly trying to recreate and to spread creation. So this is survivor's guilt. How to navigate survivor's guilt in a world built on destroying you, while the crosshairs remain fixed on all that is feminine, sovereign, indigenous, nurturing life. How to extend past the insecurity they planted deep within you by violent means for a lifetime and 500 years. My constant inner dialogue. How to claim our space, take up our sacred purpose, give life, create, build, protect, pass on, when all we have survived and endure says, you do not deserve to be here. You are meant to be dead. You will always receive pain in place of love. All the places we have cached with seeds of precious life, they will gladly suck dry until barren, until nothing is left but the anguish of trying, as if we are only, ever, always for the taking. My ancestors say, this is ancient misperception. Greed has never been able to comprehend wealth. The ones you massacred, enslaved, betrayed, they live in my ear, surround me. They live within, surround me, speak in my ear. I'm reading my own messy handwriting. They look at you and laugh. I look at them and grow strong. Survivor's guilt is the lie you tried to stick on me. The slow, pitiful death that exists only if I fear it. Guilt? The great imposter. We are experts at survival. My ancestors say, we have always been here. My job is to house the always for a while. My job is to do this despite you. I had intended to not leave everyone on like a depressing note. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Siku. So we were just conferring with Tanya, but we'll return to more of your work once we get into the discussion portion. So our next presenter is Lacie Burning. Lacie is a Mohawk multidisciplinary artist and curator raised on 6 nations of the Grand River located in southern Ontario. They work in photography, video, installation, and sculpture, and will graduate with a Bachelor of Fine Arts at Emily Carr University of Art and Design with a focus on Indigenous art. I think you have graduated. Yeah. Having come from a culturally and politically grounded upbringing, their work focuses on politics of indigeneity and identity from a Haudenosaunee perspective.
Sego sewa glego gane lafta sohoni yungas. Vancouver gena geleda no oswego nido geno. Dineke haga maginyato. I am it's in my bio, so I'm gonna translate. Just stating who I am in my language, and I guess I wanted to first talk about education. I kind of grew up in this weird time where my elder and my great aunt Ogulafgoha, she was a fluent Mohawk speaker, and she kind of started this Mohawk immersion program in a new school that me and my cousin went to, and it was only around for 2 years because people didn't want, they wanted their kids to learn English basically so they could have like a better chance at getting like a better education, and you know, like there's always that push and pull of like assimilation, I guess, and wanting to reclaim. So they kind of thought that was the only way to be successful was through English. And yeah, so my first piece is called Reflection Series, and it descends from an older piece called Story Time, which was an elder recounting their experiences at residential school. And so through this education that I had growing up, I always had access to elders, so we were always being told stories. And that earlier iteration of this piece that you see here was a video installation of like a nun with a white mask on approaching the screen in a forest. And it's kind of to the story told by this elder, which is really horrific. And that was kind of my way of processing those stories and like relaying that, because the TRC was just before it started happening. So it was really, I guess, difficult to process all those things because there was so much happening. And I feel like this is a better representation of how I would have processed that, I guess, in a more mature way. So it's this figure of like basically the nun, but kind of drawn back a little bit more, because they, like all the people who worked in the residential schools were members of the church mostly, so they all wore black usually, and so they're wearing a mirror mask and like kind of reflecting upon this, like the whiteness of settler society, which is like kind of, I felt like, you know, it's like this Canadian identity that's being mourned over, and it's something that I also have to grapple with myself, and that a lot of, like basically everyone, because it's so instilled within society, even as Indigenous people. And this was a couple of years later. I kind of reclaimed the mask to, so I was looking at a lot of the protest wear that people use, like the red bandanas, the jackets that are really personalized and stuff like that. And I just went out with my aunt into the forest because it just snowed, and basically talking about land sovereignty, like how do we enact those sovereignties over the land, and how do we see ourselves on the land. This is just last year I made this. I come from a beading family, and my great-grandma sold beadwork on the reserve, and my great-aunt taught me, but I was really bad at it. So I just, like, I never felt comfortable approaching it in a contemporary art way, but I started finding this interesting material at Dresso, which is like a really cool place in Vancouver where you can get fabrics and stuff. but it's black velvet, and that's like a material that a lot of people use for their regalia, and it's like very Haudenosaunee specific. And I just wanted to like kind of adorn this beautiful flower, and I kind of thought of it as like an ice flower, and kind of have that imagery in my work a lot. So yeah, in Mohawk we say "Ganalunqua," and it's like how we say "I love you." I know it's kind of cheesy to say that, but it's like, but it just means like there's a preciousness about you, like that I see within you, and I kind of like was thinking about that when I was making this, and it's kind of like it's something about it, so it's not it, but it's like around it. It's like surrounding it, you know. This is I made this in November last year, I think. But I found this parachute cord through Bush Gallery Citation. I was there last year at Plug-in ICA with the residency, and there was a prompt from Bush to make basketball jerseys. So we all went to the dollar store, I think. I was like, ooh, I'd really love this parachute cord. Like, I don't know what to do. And I was like, looking at it and looking at the shirt, and I was like, oh my god, I'll make my first ribbon shirt. So I made my first ribbon shirt. I think the ribbon shirt one was supposed to be first. Yeah, so that's the jacket that I made for Plug-in or Bush Gallery, and it's going to also be at Never Apart in Montreal, which is being curated by Lindsay Nixon and Adrienne Huard. But yeah, the core to me was it's like a lot about survival and like kind of using culture as like a form of survival, but also like having to create your own belonging as like queer and trans people. But yeah, so then the mask, or not the mask, but the cord wrapped around my face is kind of a descendant of that. And I began thinking more about visibility, and when I sent this to somebody who was interested, they asked me what it was about, and I was kind of thinking, like when you go into the forest, you have to wear bright orange or else you might get shot. So it's like this complicated relationship between being visible and invisible. So, and also, I guess the gaze, because I think of this gesture a lot of like confrontation, which is very present in, I guess, depictions of Mohawk people specifically. And I just really like this, you know, you're in my face kind of thing, or I'm in your face, whatever. Yeah, oh yeah. So this is more on the black velvet pieces. One of them says pain and one of them says staking. Yeah, so it's just like literally the painstaking nature of like land claims and like staking your claim in land. And there's a middle piece that I don't have a picture of, but yeah, it's like the shape of a river down the middle of that plywood. And it's like this really performative gesture where I'm like hammering all these nails into the wall, and it kind of renders the wall like destroyed. Because all the nails are so close together, and I guess it has the potential to do that kind of damage. And I like to think about like, I guess those barriers and what the walls of the gallery represent. That's all I have to say. So yeah.
So our next artist, is Eli Hirtle. He is Neha Cree, a British-German filmmaker, beadworker, and curator born and raised on the Okanagan territory, which is Victoria, BC, now Victoria, BC. His practice involves documenting and creating work about Indigenous cultural resurgence, language, revitalization, and indigeneity. His current interests are making films that tell Indigenous stories in responsible ways, mentoring Indigenous youth, and learning how to speak his ancestral language. Which I keep forgetting how to say. Nahewewe. Okay. Eli is currently the Aboriginal curator at Open Space Art Society in Victoria, BC.
Tante Nisatamatak, Eli Hirtle, Nisika-san. Hello friends and family, my name is Eli Hirtle. Before I begin, I want to thank Tanya, Toby, Jordan, and especially Richard for their words before we came up on stage. Hearing Richard speak about where we are right now, that's really important for me as a guest on these territories, to have the time here grounded in thinking of this residency in place, the stories of this place, the laws that govern this place. And so what I'm going to talk about today is, it's not about my curatorial practice at all. It's about a film project that I'm working on over the past few years. My own personal art practice has, I've been drawn towards documentary filmmaking and thinking through the ways that our stories as Indigenous people have traditionally been told through the medium of film. Thinking of these discussions that are happening in parallel ways within the art world and the film world, about who is telling our stories and how. So how I introduce myself in the language, that's something that I've only learned in the past couple of years. I'm going to talk a little bit about my own journey of getting to that place, inspired a lot by what Jordan said in his keynote, because though my story is unique and it's my own story, I think a lot of other people can relate to it, coming to their indigeneity later in life, and in however that manifests for them. So I'm 36 years old, and for the first 25 years of my life, I didn't know where my Indigenous ancestry was from. My mother was a part of the 60s scoop. She was adopted at birth. All we knew from my mother's adoption papers was from Edmonton. So it was only 12 years ago my mother found her birth mother, and we connected with our Naheo family in Red Deer, where my grandmother was living, and some of my aunts were living, and my parents and I made the trip to Alberta to meet everybody, and it was an incredibly powerful experience. The family was so welcoming. There were aunts, uncles, cousins, and one thing that really stood out to me from that experience, from that trip, was hearing my Uncle Bernie, who was raised by his Kokum, and my Kokum Florence speaking the Cree language to each other. They were the only two fluent speakers in the family. And so hearing that and being kind of overwhelmed by meeting all the family at once, there was a spark. There was something inside me, because for those first 25 years of my life, when people would ask me, "Are you Indigenous?" I would say, "Yeah, I am, but I don't know where from." And so I said that countless numbers of times over my life. And so in these past 12 years, it's been an incredibly beautiful and challenging journey of connecting with that side of my family. So through this latest film project that I'm working on, it's called Voices on the Rise. It's a 3-episode documentary series about Indigenous language revitalization throughout the province of Alberta, what is now known as Alberta. I traveled, I don't want to say most of the province because northern Alberta is vast, and I only went as far north as my family's community of Wabasca, Big Stone Creek, and Fort McMurray. They're about the same kind of distance north of Edmonton. But as far south as Waterton Lake National Park, right on the Montana border. So I had the privilege of visiting Blackfoot, Tsutana, Cree, Danaza, and Dene Sulene communities, and learning about language revitalization projects and how they're happening on the ground in community, led by passionate individuals and grassroots projects. So we could have easily focused on what's happening in the academic world of linguists and University of Calgary and Alberta, but it was a conscious decision to connect with community members on the ground and see how people are doing this out in community. And before, I guess we could run through some of the photos now. These are just some screenshots from the film and some of the people that I had the privilege of meeting with and interviewing. Before we went to Alberta to do any filming, I went on a 2-week road trip by myself without any of the rest of the crew to talk face-to-face with everybody that we were going to be filming with. I felt that was incredibly important to build relationships with people that I had been emailing with and talking with on the phone, being based out of Vancouver Island. There's only so much research and relationship building that I could do through those methods. So before we did any filming, I drove for 2 weeks straight, and I met with every single interview subject, person that was interested in being a part of the project, and met with them and told them about why I was working on this project, how I'm reclaiming language myself. I attend a language and culture group in Victoria at the Friendship Center that meets a couple times a week. And so this is really personal to me, and what these people are doing, I'm incredibly inspired by it. And so I also didn't want to go in with a prescribed story that I thought that this community had to tell. I went and met with people and said, what is the story that you want told? What are the stories of how this work is being done here in your community, in your home, in your school? So that collaborative method of documentary filmmaking I found incredibly enriching. The conversations that I would have with people led in directions that I wasn't expecting. And it meant that when I came back with the film crew a few weeks later, we could start at a deeper place. It wasn't just getting to know each other with lights and cameras around us. these people knew who I was. They had some level of trust with me. And we filmed some beautiful things. And it's being edited right now. It should be out this fall. These past few weeks I've been going through some of the interview footage to kind of help our editor tell these stories in the way that they deserve to be told, because I feel a really, really deep responsibility to every single one of these people that I met, that we interviewed, to carry their story, to tell their story in the way that they wanted it told. So one thing that really stuck out to me, that it might be leaving on a sad note, but it's the truth. And it was when I was meeting with Knowledge Keeper, Ruben Quinn, who's from Saddle Lake and teaches the Cree syllabics in Edmonton. And he was talking about where we're at in what could be deemed linguicide, the linguicide that's happened, and how his estimate, what he's been told by people, is that at one time the Cree language had 600,000 words, and he said it's now at about 30,000. So if you do the math, that's 95% of the language that's gone. That's not being spoken. It's not being taught and shared within families, within communities. So this being the United Nations Year of Indigenous Languages, there's been a lot of attention on our knowledge systems, the sophisticated science and array of knowledges within our languages that's based in relationship to land. First and foremost, that come from the land, that are specific to the lands they come from. And so this project, I think, first and foremost for me, was for communities to learn about what everybody else is doing and be inspired by that. A byproduct is that everyone else will be able to learn more about the importance of our languages. But what I'm really excited about is not centering English, or it's how our communities can learn from each other and continue to do this work in whatever way that needs to be done in our communities. So, thank you.
Thank you, Eli. Our next presenter is Arielle Twist. Arielle Twist is Nehiwa, two-spirit trans woman that creates to reclaim and harness ancestral magic and memories. Originally from George Gordon First Nation, Saskatchewan, she is now based out of Halifax, Nova Scotia. She is an author and multidisciplinary artist. Within her short career, she has attended a residency at Banff Centre for the Arts and Creativity, has work published with them, Canadian Art, The Fiddlehead, Prism International, This Magazine, and CBC Art, and has been nominated for a Push Art Prize and shortlisted in the National Magazine Award, both in 2019. Congratulations. Disintegrate, Dissociate is her first collection of poetry. Her poetry, multimedia pieces, and performances have been exhibited at art galleries countrywide, including the Cyber Centre for the Arts in Halifax, Toronto Media Arts Centre in Toronto, La Galerie Centrale Powerhouse in Montreal, Centre for Art Tapes in Halifax, the Art Gallery of Mississauga in Mississauga, Art Gallery of Nova Scotia in Halifax, and the Agnes Etherington Art Gallery in Kingston. So, thank you, Arielle.
I hate my bio. When I signed a book deal, they were like, your bio's too short, you need to brag more. So that's just the bio that's on my website that they made me brag in. So I'm not just bragging to brag. I'm gonna start, I'll just read, I just want to start with like a couple poems from my book. And then I'm gonna talk about it. So the first poem in the book is called Prelude. The night our Cookham died, my mother cried out in another language. I hear her break, the cracking of burning wood like it was my own bones between walls of mud and dust, the structure on fire. I begin to come undone by the sound. A rupture, wailing, and tears landing on purple tiles. My ears know everything in this house. I beg my eyes to stop making an ocean. Water and salt fill the crater next to me as if this bed knows nothing but loss. I weep into the space left unbodied. I think I'll leave mine too. Disintegrate or dissociate, I will deconstruct myself and rebuild in her vision. And this one's called Vacant. I'm not in the world today. I left this cage of a chest open in winter, my body still shining, no vacancy above my abdomen. They always told me that this body is mine, that autonomy is key, break down, undone, I can destroy it freely, so I will. I will snap my limbs, suck the marrow from my hungry bones and fill those hollow spaces with you. I will gut myself with hooks made of hands, flood the floorboards with tears of fluoride and flora, build enamel, break my jaw, plant seeds in the emptiness and hope that something grows. So I like to read those two because this book is about grief. I started my literary career in March 2017. Before that, I thought writing was for white people and like not accessible. I have no formal training in any way, in any art field at all. I don't even have high school diploma. But I became a sex educator through mentorship, and then I became a writer through mentorship, and now I'm becoming a visual artist and curator through mentorship. And so this book kind of came out of a place of like my first year of learning how to like write. I started with poetry because at the time my mentors, Kai Cheng Tom and Gwen Benaway, both released poetry books. A Place Called No Homeland by Kai Cheng and Passage by Gwen. And then the first time I read was in July 2017 with them at the book launch for both of their books, The Athletic, thing called Trans Girl Supernova. And yeah, this book is like going through that whole process of learning how to write. And then I signed a book deal exactly like a year after I started writing, and then I actually had to make this thing. So I think it's like comes from a really raw place. It's about grief and the many kinds of griefs that live in my body. The first poem was like about losing my grandmother. She passed away like the same week that I started my transition, so we didn't like get to like have a conversation about that. The second poem I read is about dysphoria. It's about like grieving a body. It's about like autonomy and like just like how this I have control over my body, so I will do what I want with it. And in some ways that's like destructive. So this book came out of all these griefs and came out in March. My writing practice is things. And that's my writing practice, is really fast. Next, please. Thank you. In January this year, I was like, I'm gonna start an art practice. So I was asked to be like an artist in this. I was curated by these two queer women in Halifax to do a show called Poems for Impending Doom, and they wanted me to write, but I had access to the Center for Art Tapes, and I had access to all of their materials, which meant like a camera in the studio. So I made a photo series in January, and this is it. It's called Aston. It's just queer Indigenous people eating berries. It starts off really like cute and happy, and then it gets really like sexual, and like they're like mashing berries all over their face and their bodies, and yeah, it was planned super last minute. I had a lot of fun doing it. There's also like a bunch of photos of me playing with berries that aren't in the photo series. But it was my first time like playing with any kind of visual art. And so this is like the main photo, which is my youngest sibling. And then the next one is them again. This one is in the Agnes right now still until the summer. And then this last one is my sister. We're all queer, which is really cool. And this one's in the Art Gallery of Nova Scotia. In a show with Jordan Bennett. And like a few other emerging visual artists. And yeah, I just wanted to talk about like queer sexuality, hunger, and also like kinship, and like how like when I talk about sex, I talk about it with my siblings. How we like navigate our relationships together, and how a lot of like white people around us are like really like confused about why we talk to our siblings about sex and like about relationships so openly. And it's just like I wanted it to be like about kinship and love and sex, and yeah, hunger and berries. I've been like kind of obsessed with berries. On the cover of my book, it's berries. And then my curatorial practice, which is just starting. I'm being mentored by Lindsay Nixon, and I feel as though like my whole career, it's just been like I am one of the only Indigenous trans women within art in any kind of realm, whether it be like visual or literary. And I want to start a curatorial practice that highlights trans women, Indigenous trans women specifically. So that is not something people say to any of us anymore. And that's my practice.
Thank you so much. I'd like to invite Jordan up to join us now, and we can facilitate a little bit of a conversation, and then we'll start to draw in the audience too if there's questions or comments, or elements that you want to participate with as well. So firstly, thank you all so much for sharing so bravely all these truly important and personal things that you guys are working on, drawing a lot from your own lives, which I'm certain is a difficult thing to do in a public sphere. So thank you. I just want to acknowledge how challenging that is. But I keep coming back to, as I'm listening to the conversation, and also as I was preparing for today, I keep thinking about the first line in an article that Arielle wrote for Canadian Art last year. What happens when we try to translate something that is untranslatable? And although Arielle is looking specifically at an installation by an artist named Lou Shepard, I feel like this question speaks broadly to a lot of what all of you are working through, both through the idea of language and also through text-based work, through your visual art. So I thought maybe I'd put that out there, and perhaps you can speak to your own work in relation to other things that you've been hearing or thinking about as we've been working through this afternoon. So, I'd like to start.
Start and talk with the article.
It's great.
Yeah, that was an article about a show the Shepherd put up in Halifax at the Khyber. I was asked to write a piece for it, and it was all about like translation and like Lukana and like how things are untranslatable. And it was talking specifically about queerness and like how queerness is like the space in between what is translatable. And I, like in that article at the end of it is like the piece that I wrote for Lucio, which was talking about our language and how there are like words for like gender that are translated like in gross ways. They're like, this is someone who lives like a woman, when they were actually, like they're not words that can be translated into English, like the ways that we talked about gender and sexuality and like, yeah, so I was talking about like translating and like how there's no translation for my gender, or like a lot of our genders, and so that's where that came from, that article. I think a lot about translation ever since that show. Loop show was like incredible. I forgot what I was gonna say. I lost my train of thought. Yeah. That's all I'm gonna say for now.
The first thing that comes to mind for me is the beginning of the last poem I wrote that was published in Canadian Art Magazine, and that I turned into a sealskin visual art representation, was about trying to understand intergenerational experience of dispossession and trauma, and but also healing and everything that, like, there's so much I think that gets transferred emotionally, whether it's spoken or not. I'm thinking about my father, who's like, he expresses so much just in his being and also in his actions, but he doesn't actually express very much with words. And he's fluent in Inuktitut, and he's one of the few people that he went to residential school with a whole group of people, and he was one of the very few that actually retained his language and was fluent in it. And I think that that's the most miraculous thing about him. And I asked him how he did that, and he said he just thought in the language. He kept it alive by thinking it. And so when I'm with him, when I was younger, I used to be really frustrated that he wouldn't be very like verbal, and I've had to navigate that distance, but I've also had to pay attention to what is communicated, like what is translated through other sensibilities. And so at the beginning of this poem, I'm trying to think about like intergenerational trauma and how I wonder if we have a word for that in Inuktitut. And I kind of assume we don't. But I also, then I'm thinking like, maybe we also don't have words for the reasons why it's that way. Because we never would have experienced that until just a couple of generations ago. And I think it's important. I find it also weird to be a writer as an Indigenous person, because that's not our ancestral form. But I do find for myself it's necessary as a process for me to understand things and overcome things. I think we've always been oral people. I think writing it's a voice, and I think things have always been spoken. But I think also that as much as things can be lost, like Eli is talking about how words are lost, I think also words, I've been at conferences, language conferences, where words people are getting together to think about how to create new words. And I think of the moment we're in of Indigenous writing is, I think, developing language around things that we need to develop dialogue around and language around. So I think intergenerational trauma works both ways in that, or intergenerational effects work both ways rather, where destructive things can be passed down, but I also think healing things can be passed forwards and backwards and all around. I think it's important to think about translation in those ways too.
Yeah, I think we can go off of that thread. Also, when you were saying, when you said the word for love, is it love or I love you? That I immediately thought of, and I just rewatched this interview with Ruben Quinn when he was kind of, breaking down and connecting Kisa Kirtan, which in Cree is you are loved by me. And also connecting that to Amy Mobu's piece, the syllabics, in the Indigenous Art Park in Edmonton, which is curated by Candace Hopkins. Incredible group of artists and work. And that was the first time when I interviewed Ruben Quinn at that park that he had seen that piece. And then he started to talk about, that piece, which I believe is fire, iskatu. And Ruben started telling me, and it was springtime, late spring when we were speaking, and he started to talk about how this would have been the time of year to burn the land, to bring fire to the land, and that makes me think of what Richard was kind of talking about and grounding us in before we began today. Like Ruben was talking about these root words, and there was a link between fire and you are loved by me, and how that land, you bringing fire to that land, then it will cradle you and take care of you through what is provided. So I've been, while working on this film project, it came up in almost every place. We visited about the depth and beauty and specific knowledge of places these languages come from. It cannot be translated into English. You can try to do it very poorly, but it's not going to have nearly as much of the original meaning intact. So I've been thinking of that a lot lately. Well, learning the language very, very slowly, but and also I've been reading Lindsay Nixon's book lately, which has a lot of the language sprinkled throughout, and it's beautiful to see that in a lot more of our writers across different languages, kind of reclaiming, and like this, making our languages visible and cool again. Because like you were saying, like in some communities, there's really big pushback against language revitalization because families don't think that it's necessary, that you're not going to need that to thrive or survive in the bigger world out there. But I strongly believe that it will ground us in who we are and where we come from, and that it's not one or the other. We can learn our languages and then speak English quite well as well. So.
Yeah, that's a question about translation is really interesting to me. Because the more I reflect on it, the more I think that, my performance practice, which you haven't seen, but if you come to the reading tomorrow night, yes, you'll see some of. And then that practice for me is all about translating visual work into like an auditory space. But the work I was sharing with you today is also very much about translation or transition, because for me, because it's very much about moving the spotlight from invisible to visible on Indigenous lived experience, and trying to talk openly and honestly about how expansive that is, and it's huge. And I think that's something that we've all got in common in some ways, is that diversity of experience and background. I think is really enormous. We all come from these different places. But so many of our projects are about, trying to think through what that means together. Yeah. That's
I do kind of forget the question. I just like listening to everyone.
You're more than welcome to respond. The question was about translation, and the way I was reading it through the work that all of you have been doing is not necessarily literally within language translation, but also through experience, which I think Jordan was touching on as well, just
I mean, I guess I like what Arielle was saying earlier too, that it's this gray area, and you can't really, it's not a tangible thing, and it kind of took me a long time to realize that, because I kind of, in the beginning of my practice, I guess, or even the beginning of my language learning, because we mostly spoke English, that it's how do you say I went to the store and I bought bread, something like that, but they're no, it's structured a certain way, and there's no way to actually fully, I guess, translate certain things. But I guess it's the same within the beginning of my art practice, really struggling to come to some sort of understanding through my work, and having other people have that same understanding, which is, it's really complicated. But yeah, especially working as Indigenous artists, it's that visual language is also very recent within the landscape of contemporary art, I suppose. But yeah, you just have to embrace the abstract, and that things are, I don't know, that's just how I think, and it's very visceral for me, so it's things are just, it's there.
Thank you. Would any of you like to respond to any of the others' work? Perhaps in the interest of time, I'll open the floor up to questions from the audience or comments from the audience.
Well, I had one here.
We'll get her question first, and then we'll get you afterwards.
Hi, thank you very much for having us today. I'm not a very comfortable public speaker, so I'm going to sit down. So to be a good guest in any place is to learn the language and to try to speak in and communicate within the language of that place. So how do you envision the future of the relationship between guests and your languages? And do you consider your work within that future?
I think about how growing up in Saskatchewan, the white kids had access to Cree better than we did. So I always feel like some sort of way when like a white girl comes to talk to me in Cree and I don't know what she's saying, because I didn't have access to it because I didn't go to a fancy school. Or I didn't go to university, so I couldn't like take a class. And then my res in Saskatchewan was where the last residential schools were, and there's no one in my family who speaks the language anymore. My mother went to residential school, so I always feel some kind of way when they have access, or like anyone has access to it sooner than we do. I don't know. Maybe I'm just a bitch, but I'm just like, unless a guy tried to like ask me out in Cree once, and I was like, fuck. No. I understand the concept, but like, what does it mean when none of us and our youth don't have access to language?
Yeah, I mean, I think like in a perfect world, we would all speak our own languages, and non-Indigenous peoples would engage with those languages too. I think I tend to like I feel like, you know, like part of that question, you know, like, I mean, everything just like leads back to like colonialism for me. And I tend not to think very often about like how non-Indigenous peoples could do better. Because like the root of that question is always just give the land back to us. And I'd love to imagine a future where that's possible. But you know, I think it's actually like a really complicated question to work around, because it goes so deeply.
So I always surprise myself when I go here. By that I mean, part of me wants to say I'm uncomfortable with it because of the things that are in the way, the personal things, like the way colonialism has become so personal and created this severance that's very painful for us as Indigenous people. But at the same time, I do a lot of work with people in the land, and that's been really humbling for me. It has necessarily humbled me and made my thinking not so black and white. And when I'm working on the land, I'm always being reminded that we take direction from the land, and the land has set the laws, it set the terms. The language does come from the land, and the ways that we live in societies and relate to one another and to everything around us. That's not set by human beings, and that's not set by my brain. That's set by a spirit that has been in place long before and long after me. And so my job when I'm running programs is to help orient everybody to be there in a good way and to help teach what I can of the worldview of that place. I teach in Dene territory, where I'm from, and I teach a lot of what I learned from my dad. And those teachings I have to share with everybody that's there, and sometimes it's non-Indigenous people that have come there to learn. And I've had to get over my own hang-ups with that. And I think where my understanding would be, my answer to your question would be, is that if everybody is living according to that worldview, if everybody's living on the land, relating the way that we're meant to, the way that that territory demands, which is completely respectful of diversity, and that everybody has something to bring, everybody has a place, and it's also humanizing. So when you're living in relationship to things that way, your own humanity is being restored too. And I'm not a fluent language speaker. I have little bits and pieces of Inuktitut, and I'm always trying to learn whenever I get a chance. But I believe that the land does speak through language, and the language has concepts that orient how you think about things. So, like, I don't think the language would be inherently destructive of us. Like, I don't think that our terms for things would enable us to be destructive. I think that it's oriented towards life, towards balance, and I think it would be really valuable if all of our society can shift towards communicating with more humanity and respect. I think that would be really a great benefit to the state of our world and to the way that we treat each other. So personally, though I struggle with it, I do support it.
I guess there's like a lot of language programs out there that are struggling right now, and I just think like there's always like a non-Indigenous person online being like, oh, I want to go and take Cree lessons. It's like if you have the means to do that, I wish I could encourage those people to be like, oh, I'll sponsor a spot for a Cree person who can't afford to take this class, maybe, like stuff like that. And then it's kind of like maybe we'll get to that point where non-Indigenous people, or it's like normal to learn in like an outskirts part of town near a reserve or something, say, because on Six Nations there's a lot of people who live in the towns outside of Six Nations, and it's like it would be nice if they had access to the language too, and that doesn't mean that non-native kids wouldn't be able to take that class. It would be kind of optional. So I always think about that, because in my school system there was parents had the option of like French, Cayuga, or Mohawk as like their second language class, but it was like very minimal, like the same way how I guess they do in most public schools, where they would learn French, but they only know like how to count to 10 and stuff like that. So, it's kind of like that. That's all I have to say.
I'll keep my response kind of short, so we can have some more questions. Hopefully about just language in general, or these amazing writers on this panel. I think we should direct some energy that way too. But I agree with Arielle. Like and with what Lacie was just saying too. I think it's important to know how to say hello and thank you in the local language, but I also believe that that these resources need to be going to Indigenous folks reclaiming language. I think thinking of like salvage and anthropology, and that makes me think of like there's a lot of linguists at a lot of universities that are spending years of work advancing their careers, documenting languages so they can sit in a book and be put on a shelf, and it's not alive, and it's advancing their academic careers, and it's not benefiting the communities that they're working within. And I don't think that's a unique story. I think that's happened in a lot of ways in a lot of places. So I think that a lot of these programs are searching for money, for stable funding, and that's how people could support revitalization of our languages.
Hello. I have a short question for Eli Hirtle. And going through your slides, you had a slide up there with looked like a map, or was it something that was being translated? It was a square with some arrows and different openings. Was that what was that exactly? And the second question pertaining to that is, I recognize the hand, and I'm wondering if that was local and whose hand that was in that picture, because I think I know whose hand it was. Maybe you can tell me or not.
It was not local to here.
No?
Yeah. That project is filmed all in Alberta, and only in Alberta, so that.
Travels to Alberta and all around. This hand.
Oh, okay. That's Reuben Quinn. Yeah, he's a knowledge keeper from Saddle Lake. He's stressed to me many times that he's not a fluent speaker and does not want to be called an expert in the language, but he does teach the syllabics, or what he likes to call the spirit markers. So that syllabics, there's several ways that they can be written out, and this is the way that he was taught in the early 70s, and the way that he shares with the community in Edmonton. So there's a lot of knowledge within those and the way that they're written that I couldn't even begin to talk about.
Right.
Yeah, exactly, translate. I'm trying to figure out how I can spend a chunk of time in Edmonton next year, so I can spend more time in Wabasca, in my Cookham's community, which is three hours north of Edmonton, and so I can take one of Reuben's classes. So I've talked to people who have taken that, and it's been transformative for them. And something that I've learned was that, and from a couple of different people, that learning the Cree language through the syllabics apparently it can really accelerate your ability to speak. Something I want to know more about and research more about.
Thank you. I'll just say I grew up in Edmonton, in Inglewood, around a lot of Cree, and I learned a lot of words on the playground that I probably won't repeat. And most likely because I won't repeat them properly. Thanks. Or the correct meaning.
So I think we have time for one more question. Was there one? Maybe two.
Oh, sure. No, go ahead.
This question is for Siku. I really admire the way you describe the complexity of I guess, survival and surviving. And as someone with a mixed background, what you're saying resonates, and I think you kind of become a professional listener because you have so many different backgrounds going on, and you seem to communicate the complexity in such an amazing way. So I'm wondering, in your process, could you explain what listening is to you? Sorry.
Or how to listen better.
Thank you so much for those very kind words. I think listening for me it's scary, and I also think it's necessary. The reasons that I sit with things is because I feel like intuitively I need to. It's scary because I think when you look at history and society and the reality of where we've ended up, there's a lot of loss, there's a lot of pain, and it implants these beliefs or these barriers that when I look at the people I love, that I come from and belong to, I just want to remove all those barriers, like when you really love someone and they don't believe in themselves or they don't love themselves, like you can see it so clearly and they can't, they're trapped. And I have to think my own way through those things. I feel like the reasons why it's important for me to really embrace these contrasts is because I think that's the only way to really to hold something as a whole, to hold myself together as a whole. And I think that's the power spot, where if you can sit in the center of all of like the renewal, those things they're like medicine working on you. If you are going through something and you're kind of processing medicine, it'll make you feel like all kinds of emotions at once. You'll feel like sick, you'll feel like purging, but you'll also feel cleansed. And to me, like that's a lot of what the process is. So it's terrifying, but I think it's important to also just find your ground in it. And I think there's no how to, nobody's come up with a how to get over the hump of colonization. Nobody's broken through and been able to look back and be like, this is how you do it. I think everybody is intuitively navigating that and creating it as we go along. So I just think the whole process is listening. Like Lacie was saying, like it's just there. So you kind of you either choose to sit with it and let it teach you, or you kind of try and avoid it, but you never really avoid it, I don't think. Thank you. Thank you.
One more question for Peter, and then we will.
Spoiled. You're spoiling me. It's a privilege to listen to you folks today, and it's a privilege to be in this room. And as we walk forward with ideas, right? We move forward. It's part of our medicine is ideas, And I think often we have these conversations at the end where we're talking about, or like coming up against this idea of colonization, or a wall, right? And I also really love the conversations about language and language revitalization. So I want to just be selfish and take a moment for one selfish idea, and then I have a really quick question about for all of you folks who feel comfortable, who not coming up against a wall, right? And so one of the things I just want to say is, I think it's time that galleries start selling those goddamn group of 7 paintings and giving us the money so we can start having language revitalization. That's what you taught me today. Thank you for that. And then just back to your Arielle, your bio and ancestor magic. I just think that's such a wonderful idea. So we're idea folks, right? So if any of you folks there want to share, I want to know more about ancestor magic, actually, from you folks, if you feel comfortable. Thank you.
When I first started writing, I did like this writing workshop with Catherine Hernandez, who wrote Scarborough, which did very well. And she, it was like a BIPOC closed space, and she just talked about like ancestors, and then we all ended up writing about our grandparents, like just from the prompts. We all like wrote about like the same thing, which like is kind of like where my book started, since I started writing about my grandmother. I think about like matriarchs, and then I also think about like how like trans femmes and trans women were like the most powerful matriarchs. I often think about like Aeona Miracle's work and how like powerful and beautiful it was, and how like trans folks were like knowledge keepers, and you couldn't do ceremony without us, and we were really important. So that's where that comes from. I'm just like I want to like bring back this idea of matriarch that like that really centers trans women again. That talks about like actual like magic and where we're not dying on our reserves, and we're able to access art, and how I feel like art is magic. This was like healing, and also it gave me community. Like it gave me like trans siblings, which I didn't have in like my little tiny community. So that's what I think is like this magic, this new like queer and trans art canon, and like we're bringing something magic.
I think about my ancestors a lot because it kind of started from a place of being like, oh, intergenerational trauma, why am I so sad? Like, oh, that's why. And then it's like, now you kind of learn to be empowered by them, basically. Like, I think of them a lot. And it's like where we draw, as Haudenosaunee people, that's where we draw our strength from in order to like think of the future. So it's like, that's a big part of how we try to live our lives. And yeah, I was also, I'm glad you brought Aeona Miracle up. I just think of like, sometimes I'm like, I'm not an actual artist, it's just my ancestors working through me, because like, she says, they come to me and they whisper in my ears. There's like a video of her online. And I think about that a lot. I'm like, yeah, that's what I feel like. It's like you're just sitting there and it doesn't feel like you're at work. It feels like you're working through a dialogue, I guess. And there's just something really nice about sitting with that, and then feeling like you're not alone within your own practice, because it's in dialogue with so many other things. And for a long time I was also not comfortable talking about being queer, being trans in my art, and also like we're just emerging now too. So yeah, shout out to Lindsay Nixon, Arielle Twist, all of them. Ancestor magic at work. Yeah.
As you know, Peter, I was part of this group artist project with Marianne Nicholson in her community, Kinka Inlet, called Hexa, which means to be here always. And part of that project was being in her community and feeling like I'm staring at a wall and not knowing, like being a visitor to this culture and feeling like the community is a very powerful place and feeling like the ancestors there are very present and powerful. And me sitting, feeling like such an outsider and feeling like there's a lot that's inaccessible and what am I doing here? And then what happened was I feel like my ancestors got together with the ancestors there and were like, all right, we got something in the works for her. And I think they did that with like every one of the artists on that project, the ones that were from there and the ones that were visiting. And I went home and I ended up starting this process of finishing a poem and turning it into a visual art piece, and it was incredibly labor intensive and lots of meltdowns along the way. And what emerged was something I never could have imagined, and it really reconnected me. Really, I felt like it was guided with my own ancestors and really, really reconnected me with cultural material practice. And the poem is about both my parents, and I ended up having this vision come up when I was in Kinka Inlet. There was this memory of these mountains that are in my dad's homeland, and I remember seeing them when I was little, but the vision I was having was somehow connected to this word that people in Pandan used to call my mom, and I always wondered why, and I knew it was connected to that landscape, and I didn't understand the connection. And I ended up having to reach out to my dad and asking him to tell me why was my mom, why did they give her this nickname? And he ended up telling me the most beautiful thing like he's ever said to me about my mom. And it was that landscape, it's called Akya when you're from Pandan. It just means beautiful violet island. It's the name for these mountains. When you're in Pandan, you're looking out, you see these beautiful mountains. And he said that was anybody that was away from home, like he meant taken away from home and going to school. When they get homesick, they think about that landscape. That's what they held inside, and they always longed to go back. And he said, when they asked me what was her name, I told them Akya. And it just made me realize, like, there is so much love for that land and love for what you carry inside. And for him to give her that name, he must have loved her an incredible amount. That was something I felt like was gifted to me, both looking at somebody else's landscape and remembering. It was like a mirror where I was remembering home too, and through the gift of reconnecting with my dad and having to ask him that really scary question, and he gave that answer, something came together. So I felt like the Wagwakyok ancestors and my ancestors, like, they're super magical.
I think maybe that is a good point to end this conversation. So I just want to once again express gratitude to Richard Armstrong for joining us today and for talking us through the knowledge from the Okanagan territory. We're grateful to be here. I'm grateful to be here. And also thank all of the artists and writers today on the panel for sharing such incredible stories and personal connection to the work that they're doing for all of you, for all of us. So thank you.